Hello, I'm Wasiq Wasiq, a national security analyst based in the UK. I'll be hosting an open forum discussion on the role social media is playing in fracturing multicultural Britain. I'll be joined by Charlotte Littlewood, Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, Sarah Gates, Director of Hindu Human Rights Australia, and also Dr. Vishal Vora, a socio-legal academic. I do hope you can join us. Good evening and welcome to Open Forum, where difficult issues can be discussed both openly and respectfully, with a view to advance the debate and seek a way forward for a prosperous and cohesive society. My name is Wasiq Wasiq, and I'm a national security analyst, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. Tonight's topic will be social media gaze, a threat or an opportunity. Social media is a powerful tool. It played a key role in the Arab Spring, where ordinary citizens mobilized themselves and took to the streets to protest against their own leaders. Indeed, such was the impact that social media played that hashtags have become a normal part of our lexicon, whether we see that in the Black Lives Matter movement with BLM or even the Me Too movement to raise awareness of women's rights. In any case, social media has the potential for great benefit, but there are some downsides to it. We have seen some social media used for nefarious purposes. For example, when ISIS were at their peak, social media was a key tool of communication and of recruitment. When the global COVID pandemic hit 2 years ago, social media again played a key role in promoting conspiracy theories. But do the harms outweigh the benefits? Or should we accept that harmful content and behavior will always exist? Therefore, we have to get better at managing it. To discuss these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel of guests. Our first is Sarah Gates. Sarah Gates is the Director of Hindu Human Rights in Australia. Our second guest is Dr. Vishal Vora. Dr. Vishal Vora is a socio-legal academic based in the UK. And finally, but not least, we have Charlotte Littlewood, a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. The format of tonight's discussion will be, each speaker will have between 5 to 7 minutes to speak. I'll then ask some follow-up questions and then open it up to the public. We are going to start with Dr. Sarah, or Sarah, from the Director of Human Rights in Australia. And if you are on social media, please do follow the hashtag social media gaze, and also follow our Twitter account, which is the Open Forum UK. The floor is yours, Sarah.
Thank you, Wasiq, and wonderful to be here tonight with such esteemed guests and brilliant minds, so that we can look at some of the, the problems and some of the opportunities, the lessons that we've learned from Leicester, and move forward from this towards some social cohesion and some shared values and principles. So, it may be unusual for listeners to hear my Australian accent and wonder, well, what is it that I have to do with this? As you can see, I have a family history from the UK. I've lived in the UK, and I have some understanding of the cultural dynamics. I've been researching in my PhD some of the issues of social cohesion in multicultural societies, and looking at some of the challenges that we're facing at an international scale with unpredictable climate change, with the increasing interconnectedness of systems. And you can see, I think, from Leicester that there are lessons, some gaps in our knowledge, and some of them contributed to the unrest. So interconnected social networks and the ways in which they can be used for positive and, as Wasiq pointed out, nefarious purposes, they have become, the subject of academic studies. I don't think there's a standardized social media monitoring system in academia. I think that we're sort of going with it on the fly, and that has also generated some issues with the Leicester unrest, as well as representing other, minor crises and incidents that happened locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, as in response or reaction to the unrest and the social media in particular. And some of the stories that were told on social media from the beginning. Now, I don't want to situate the beginning where the media have situated it. I have had a quick look at what's available on the internet, and I can see that there have been studies on social cohesion in Leicester conducted for some decades, and the different dynamics of that community have already been looked into a fair while ago, and I think that those studies need to be updated because demographic changes have occurred in the last 10 years since the last census, and different influences have come into the town, as we saw through social media, and some of those influences are not local. And I think this was picked up by the media, but it did so in a fairly prejudiced way, in my opinion. So part of my academic studies involves research on xenophobia, bias, prejudice, intersectarian hatred, and social discord. And when I was monitoring the social media in the lead up to the unrest, those sort of issues came out in the comments more than even in the posts. So we had inflammatory posts being made on Twitter, Instagram, on YouTube. We had them made on not-for-profit organisations, media portals. They were bolstered and promoted by mainstream media, by politicians. Some of the narratives that were originally created, they came from official sources, particularly the one that was a mistranslation of Pakistan Murdabad at the cricket match. And I think that set off a round of concern that was unwarranted and escalated tensions, which then resulted in possibly, if we can find the connections between the incidents, an attack on a Hindu home. I mean, during Ganesh Chaturthi, I have a list of incidents that took place, and I don't want to get bogged down in the list of incidents, but when you add them and tally them up, you can see that most of the known hate crimes were committed against Hindus, and that didn't get enough media attention. And Hindus were scrutinised in the way that victims are often scrutinised by the media, as if they were to blame. So there was a lot of victim blaming, a lot of speculation about their ideologies and so forth, and what they were bringing into the country, and it did arouse some anti-immigrant sentiment, which is quite disturbing for a multicultural country where immigrants, migrants are actually quite well settled, and there's a long relationship of migration between India and the UK going back to the colonial period. So it was quite hurtful, I think, to see this level of anti-immigrant sentiment that became a national conversation. And some of the commentators have blamed multiculturalism. So I wanted to expand on this idea a little bit, because to have some type of social cohesion, there needs to be some shared principles, some shared values. Some of them would be democratic values, the limits of being able to exercise your free speech. They could be religious freedom, knowing that each party has the same amount of religious freedoms as the other. So we did see some, attempts to curb the religious expression of the Hindu community, which were notable as human rights, potentially human rights issues. And so some of these shared principles and values we see here in Australia when these type of issues come up, and a lot of the public discourse does address, I guess, ethnic, racial, cultural, religious discrimination, and our values here in Australia about inclusion, diversity, and upholding, the rule of law, that there's limits. And what are those limits? I think everybody's becoming quite familiar with that, especially since social media is a place where those kind of debates take place. And so that's a positive of social media. But there were some limitations, and there certainly was a problem with the academic study of social media. there were problems with the parameters and the types of media that were being, I guess, analysed. They weren't analysed, I think, proportionately to their influence. So a lot of the impact was actually on Instagram. And then we had the BBC doing a Twitter analysis, and Twitter, you know, there was activity there, but how much of that could be geolocated? There's so many questions, and there was no consistent, I guess, methodology. There was a report from Contagion Institute that was more, I guess, you know, number crunching, but Charlotte's report had that sort of human element to it. And I think the human element is so important with social media analysis and looking at the comments, because it was in the comments that we saw threats to hurt, threats to harm, threats to pop up, threats to kill, threats to ethnically cleanse. So these were quite serious threats in the lead up to the incident on the 17th. And those threats, I think, need to be closely looked at by counter-extremism in the UK. But moving forward, I think there needs to be a moderation of views for public consumption. So you may have all kinds of private views, but when it comes to your public influence, your public impact, I think there's a responsibility to make sure that those views actually align with the common principles and the common views. And we didn't see that coming from either the media or these NGOs, and the community messaging, you know, when it came to trying to curb some of these issues, it was inadequate. The police did what they could, but there was an inadequate and inappropriate response from some of the community groups that actually, whether it was by omission or commission, fostered this dynamic and this build-up of tension. So that needs to be looked into and more responsibility taken. And, you know, when it comes to actually, you know, trying to resolve these issues, it's very difficult to resolve a problem if you don't know what it is. So a judicial inquiry is something that I know the Hindu community in Leicester are calling for. And that has a level of oversight and a whole range of different protocols that need to be conducted so that inquiry is transparent, it's fair, and it's impartial. So we haven't heard much about the so-called independent inquiry, but I think that, you know, police responses, community responses are going to be very difficult to manage without having that oversight from above, from the Home Office, because each one of those actors played a role in actually, you know, either dealing with or not dealing with the situation that was known from the 4th, well, from the cricket match all the way through. It was known to the police and to counter-extremism and to the authorities, and they weren't prepared for what took place. So I have discussed the importance of shared values and promoting those values towards social cohesion. And I think each party needs to take some responsibility for making sure that happens, because we do live in a multipolar world, and it is a multicultural planet. And we do need to understand and accept differences, and at the same time give space for people to have differences. And, you know, also have a general overview of we are one people on this planet, and we have to find ways to get along now, because things are only going to get more difficult as climate change and the different geopolitical issues continue. So that's my overview, and I do hope that people are benefited by that.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah. That was very enlightening and very thorough of you to document so much of what has happened over the summer of 2021 in terms of the riots that took place in Leicester. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you mentioned, which is the judicial inquiry. And I suppose some of the public who would end up having to fund this, because this would be publicly funded, is what is it that you think or you hope would come out of this judicial inquiry? Or do you think it's too much or too far of a step for a judicial inquiry so soon? Because some people may consider what's happened in Leicester as just a one-off. It was a series of events. It might not happen again. So is it really worth taking such a step forward when there are other inquiries and other reports that are happening in parallel?
Well, a stitch in time saves 9, and the cost to the public of the unrest is already quite high. If you look at it in a holistic sense of looking at the impact on Leicester's, actually the whole UK's, I guess their public relations, it doesn't look good when this type of thing happens. And Leicester's a community that's known and actually profits off this multicultural diversity that needs to be celebrated and resurrected. So the sooner that happens, the better for Leicester, to build strong bonds and networks within the community and to restore their dignity to the entire community. But I think prevention is better than cure. And so what's invested now in terms of recognising institutional responses and fine-tuning improvements and setting up preventative strategies, what's put in place now can prevent this from spreading, because we saw that it was about to spread. And if it wasn't for the police actually intervening quite strongly and having heavy presence at each of the venues that these incidents were planned to take place, this could have spread to 5 or 6, 7 different communities. So it was curbed, and yes, I think the sooner the better. Prevention's better than cure, and a stitch in time saves 9. And it's lessons for everybody. It's lessons for everybody all over the world, because this is actually happening in diasporas all over the world. This anti-Hindutva versus Hindutva Islamism type of ideological debate, it needs to be had. But at the root of it, these issues go deeper, and that deeper root needs to be understood, and that can't be done without a judicial inquiry.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah. Okay, we're going to go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Vishal Vora. Dr. Vishal Vora is based in Berlin, Germany. So my apologies for that, Dr. Vora. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to try and answer the question, social media gaze, is it a threat or an opportunity? And I'm going to start with a sort of opening that there is no clear answer. It's probably a bit of both. But following on from Sarah and her excellent analysis of what took place in Leicester, I think it's clear to say and to summarize that social media played a huge role in Leicester. And certainly the hostility that was seen on social media has obviously negatively affected social cohesion in Leicester. And the immense power of social media quickly divided the Leicester community. And this added to the widespread civil unrest last September. But looking at the actual civil unrest which took place, it demonstrates that the true power of social media still is not fully understood. I mean, the Leicestershire police, as Sarah said herself, were guilty themselves of circulating misinformation. But by the time it was flagged as such, the damage had already been done and people were acting upon this false information. But I feel there's an opportunity here as well. Social media pinpointed vast numbers of crimes committed during the Leicester civil unrest, most of which fall under the category of being religiously aggravated. I feel that the Hindu community in Britain, in Leicester and Britain globally, need to encourage the Crown Prosecution Service and the Leicestershire Police to follow the prosecuting guidelines on such hate crimes. And by using the data that is available on social media, I think that they will be successful in bringing prosecutions. This should be totally possible. Social media is a part of society that needs to be policed properly. I also feel, and I echo the words of Sarah, I also feel that Leicester does need a statutory inquiry, and this is something that needs to be done sooner the better. But speaking more generally, what do we actually know about social media? The internet, and more specifically social media, is a central part of most people's lives. More than 4 billion people use the internet to communicate, learn, participate in the economy, and organize themselves socially and politically. And despite this huge number, there are only 2 companies in control: Meta, previously known as Facebook, and of course Google. Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, and Instagram have over 2.5 billion daily users, and Google accounts for over 90% of global search engine use. These online domains are currently not policed whatsoever, and this is highly dangerous. Excuse me for a moment. These online domains are not currently policed. And we saw that this not policing these types of domains, how it played out in Leicester. Social media was awash with misinformation, and it's very difficult to understand what is real information and what is not. And I believe that Charlotte will be raising this in her talk. These companies, Meta and Google, seem to know everything about us, but we know absolutely nothing about them. And I feel that this power imbalance must change. And this change will only come with government controls. But this in itself is highly complex, with laws of this nature being very difficult to draft and, of course, enforce. What I mean is that social media is a huge presence and is unlikely to go away anytime soon. Therefore, we must begin to harness its power and use these opportunities carefully. I'll end with a very practical example. As a socio-legal researcher, I feel there is a need to properly understand what actually happened in Leicester. And by this, I mean to delve deeper and to explore underlying attitudes and understand the hidden tensions between these 2 community groups, with the goal of improving their relationship and adding to positive social cohesion. There have been 2 reports. Sarah mentioned them. There's the report that you'll hear about next, and there's also one from the USA, the Network Contagion Lab report. But I propose another type of project, a listening initiative, which would mean going to Leicester and speaking to those directly affected by the events of last September. And whatever these participants have to say, I want to be able to hear it. I feel that only with a full picture of what took place and how it affected these people can we begin to find effective solutions that are going to assist social cohesion between these community groups. I believe what happened in Leicester is a real wake-up call to the British Hindu community, and action needs to be taken. And I look forward to any comments you may have.
Dr. Vora, that was very enlightening. I just wanted to ask a question in terms of your listening initiative. I think that's a really interesting idea. As part of that initiative, and to bring some of those or those communities together, would you also invite some of the individuals who have been alleged to be perpetrators as part of that initiative, and to hear perhaps their viewpoint and why they perhaps did what they did, or at least justified what they did in terms of presenting themselves as defending themselves against a potential threat that they've obviously thought of. So in terms of moving forward, would that include also some of those people who have been accused of being perpetrators against the Hindu community in Leicester?
Thank you for the question. I think it would have to. I think any kind of listening initiative would have to include everyone. The only thing I would say, and I'm mindful that this is a highly sensitive situation. We've already seen that the Mayor of Leicester did try to initiate an inquiry, and that inquiry then was cancelled because the academic put in charge of that felt that he could not provide an answer that would be accepted by both communities. So I appreciate that this is a very, very sensitive area. And I say that it's sensitive because there have been, I think Sarah talked about this in her discussion, there has been a disproportionate amount of media time given to some people versus others. And I think that the listening initiative has to start by listening to these minority voices who perhaps aren't used to expressing themselves, perhaps they're new migrants to the UK. I think that we need to sort of handle this with kid gloves. So I think that I would want to have some sort of methodological approach which would allow these minority voices to also be heard. Because I feel that there were voices, certainly in the media coverage that I analysed during the Leicester civil unrest, there were some incredible people in the media talking in a very polished way, and they knew exactly how to approach the media. And I think that the listening exercise would need to make sure that that is totally balanced. I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dr. Vora. Okay, we're going to go to our final speaker, and that's Charlotte Littlewood. Charlotte Littlewood is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and has also published a report on the Leicester unrest. And as part of that, she went a bit further and actually got a qualitative point of view by talking to some of those who were affected by it. So, Charlotte, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Asik, and thank you, the Open Forum, for having us all on today. It's a brilliant opportunity to talk not only about the work we're doing, but about this very important question as we move yet again into another year of what social media means to us. And I think it's important to look not just at the opportunities, but the risks, as we have been doing. So I'm really going to pick up on what's already been said and take it that little bit further. I think, first of all, it is important to clarify we're talking from a perspective of Western liberal democracies. The question of whether social media is an opportunity or risk, if you posed it to other parts of the world, would be very different. And I'm saying that, picking up on how Wasik introduced the topic, is that when you're looking at the Arab Spring, for example, social media was an opportunity. It was an opportunity to bring knowledge from around the world to people living in countries where there is no freedom of press. What we have is freedom of press and an ability through that to have access to news, not only from our major platforms, but obviously from people who are not necessarily equipped to give news. And that's where the issue comes in for us in the Western democratic world. So that's why we're focusing this discussion here today. Also, for me personally, I've decided to narrow this down to Twitter because it's something that I have a lot of experience with. But as Dr. Vishal Vora has said, social media is owned by 2 companies and it's large, it's across many platforms. But for me to really answer this in any way that is insightful, according to my research and professionalism, it would be to look at Twitter. So I'm relying also on Leicester as we are this evening, but I'm also going to look at what's happened with Kanye West very recently with Twitter as well. So we have seen a huge amount of misinformation, and it was picked up by the temporary chief constable, Robert Nixon, in Leicester as one of the fundamental reasons why we saw the unrest. And I have never seen the police have to come onto Twitter and dispel misinformation. So this really shows the extent of the problem. And this misinformation did directly lead to violence. It directly led to the protests and the attacks on temples and the attacks on homes. So it has a real life impact. This misinformation was handled well by the police, but was not handled well by our mainstream press. So we had questions here about the press's ability to do due diligence. But what I think really came out of Leicester, for me and for many, was how the onus really is now on us as the receivers of this information to be more critical in our consumption. So we have regulatory laws in place, and we have a new online safety bill that's been put forward and is hopefully coming into effect very soon. But it has been decided, the debate around the online safety bill, it has been decided that this will be about limiting illegal material for those over 18, not illegal and harmful, just illegal. So we are left to sift through the fake news. We are left to sift through hate. And as Sarah so well put, we need to be responsible in how we also deliver information. we need to be responsible in making sure what we give to the world is about cohesion and is about shared values. So there's responsibilities as a consumer and responsibilities as someone who is publishing, something that we've seen nefarious actors take full advantage of. So what I would like to focus on as we come to a close of this really insightful talk this evening is how do we become critical consumers of information online? So hopefully you can see on your screens now a toolkit, and my toolkit, that's actually the map. We've not gone through that. Okay. This is the toolkit. That what we've just hurtled through there actually is a map of freedom of press. You can easily access that if you Google it, so you can see which countries are deemed to have less freedom of press than others. And I think when you look at opportunity and risk, you can really base that on the map here. We'll just skip through them a little bit. Can we show the next slide? If you just, that's great. This is false claims that were made on social media that really brought the threat to the Hindu community. False claims of RSS and Hindutva, which, as if you've read the report or looked at any of the press relating to our report, you've seen that this was a false allegation. Those involved had nothing to do with RSS or Hindutva. But this is really important, this use, and this will reflect in the toolkit. Don't worry, stay there, we'll get to the toolkit. This will reflect in the toolkit that we need to start identifying key narratives and key false narratives. And this was one that was repeated and repeated and repeated. And if you had done your digging, if you'd done your own investigation, you'd have known this was false. And every time you saw it, you'd have known it was false. And you'd start to pick up who is sending this, who is sharing this. And you as a consumer will be able to identify who's passing on false information. And next slide, please. So we just, yeah. And again, use of images, this was wholly irresponsible. Organizations in the UK shared this as well. Very irresponsible to share images with these kind of labels, brought direct violence against this group. They were brutally attacked with knives. So it just shows the real on the ground impact. Okay, can the next slide, please. And this is, as I was saying, how the police were sharing rebuts to the misinformation, which was very useful, but something we've never seen before. Okay, if we can look at the, yes, if we could look at the toolkit now, that would be great. So these are things that you can do. I understand this is onerous, this is time consuming, but I think this is just engaging in a few of these brings you into a position of critical thinking that will make you be able to consume this information more safely. I understand a freedom of information request takes time, but have a go at doing one. Engage with the police. If you see something that's online about police, it's going to take 20 working days, but have a go, engage with the process. A, you'll be able to understand how it works, but B, you're going to increase your trust and your understanding of the tools at hand and increase your critical thinking capacity. And I think that's really important. Do your own background checks on speakers and experts. Sometimes they will be legitimate experts. Sometimes they won't. And sometimes if you do a shallow background check, you'll just see what other people are saying about these people. You need to go deeper than that. You need to actually look at what these, sorry, I've gone dark. You need to actually look at what these people have said themselves, look at what they've written, look at her speeches that they have given, and judge them on their output, not on what others are saying about their output. That's very important. And this kind of links to following references back to their points of origin. Even the press will reference something, and that reference will have come from somewhere that may not be entirely accurate. One of the famous ones, I'm actually going to use one of the agitators who was a real problem in the Leicester unrest, but he was unfairly labelled once with something. So Majid Freeman, dare I say it, Islamist extremist. He has given prayers for brothers of ISIS fighters. That was misquoted. Prayers for ISIS brothers, very different. That circulated around the press. It was a linguistic error. If you dig down back through the references yourself, again, it's timely, but I think we need to start getting used to using these skills. You can see what people have really said, where they come from. he is still given prayers for Taliban, and he is still called for the death, or implied for the calling for the death of Salman Rushdie. I'm in no way supporting him and his beliefs, but he is a good example of where you can get these things wrong if you don't follow the references back. Check the dates, posts, images and videos. This was something that I learned on the go in Leicester. Images were being created, some were real, some weren't. And a really easy way is to check their date when they were released. And does that add up? Does that make sense? If it doesn't, dig a little deeper. Engage with other opinions. I mean, we do get stuck in our echo chambers. It sounds wild, but engage with other opinions. It's really important. It'll test your own narratives, and you might learn something. And then I think this has been very much spoken about with our previous speakers, holding press and social media to account. If you have been wrongfully attributed a label, Hindutva, RSS, and it has affected you, it's brought risk to you, it's affected who you are in a professional sense, push for legal redress, libel, speak to the police, complain to, like we've seen protesters outside of the BBC, complain and protest. This is very important because the press do not tend to get involved if they think they're going to get sued on an issue. This has pros and cons to it because they are in some ways controlled by the fear of libel, and we see that they don't speak on certain topics as freely as they should. But if you, as a Hindu community, are the only community that are not standing up for yourself, then you are the path of least resistance, and you will be written about in an unfavorable tone because newspapers want to sell their newspapers. They want to talk about a story. They're going to talk about a story that's going to cost them the least risk. And at the moment, you're the community of the least risk. So it's really important that you continue to stand up for yourself. So that would be my guide generally is how we can be critical consumers, but also specifically speaking into Leicester as a Hindu community, how we can reflect on what happened there. I think finally, just to wrap up, we have spoken about grievances and aggrieved communities. That's what this created, a grievance in the Hindu community. And nefarious actors online will now use this as an opportunity. The far right will come knocking. So be careful who you're engaging with online. Be careful now not to be manipulated by extremists with extremist agendas themselves, because this community needs, as we've said, a judicial review. It needs these grievances and the false news addressed. And whilst that's not happening, there's vulnerability, and into the vulnerability will speak extremism. So be careful, would be my final comment. Be careful.
Thank you very much for that, Charlotte. That was very, very thorough and very interesting to hear your thoughts and also the research that you've done on that. So if anyone hasn't seen the report, please go to the Henry Jackson website and you can download the report for free and look at the hard work that Charlotte's put into exposing what's actually happened in terms of Leicester. So one of the questions I'd like to ask you, Charlotte, in terms of the toolkit, which I think is a fantastic idea. It's really good in terms of it systematizes a way of holding social media companies to account, equipping perhaps the public or institutions in terms of understanding what is being put out there, when and how to verify it. Do you think some of those areas are more geared towards some elements of society, so just the general public, and others are more geared towards those institutions? How would you recommend actually putting this out there on a wider scale? Is there some sort of policy recommendation that you're looking towards? Is there some sort of training that you're hoping to do in terms of perhaps mosques or temples, gurdwaras, churches, things like that, even schools? I know you've done a report on anti-Semitism in schools, so things like that. So could you give us a bit more information about how we can use this toolkit?
Yes, of course. I think actually this was something that I've developed over the last couple of days, speaking with you about this event this evening. But I think a greater focus on this and having toolkits that can be used more generally about how we can identify images, whether they are legitimate, videos if they're legitimate, how we can investigate speakers and who they are and what their agendas are. And then you can have a more in-depth toolkit that looks at things like freedom of information requests and delving deep into deep referencing checks. So there's this obviously sort of a general rule of thumb we can apply, and then there's something that's more particular. I actually do know that Bellingcat is doing training into how you can be investigators yourself. Bellingcat being the organization that started by investigating acts by Russia. So that's an interesting organization. It's interesting what they're doing, and hopefully at some point along the line, it's something that we can work with them on with schools, especially looking at Leicester. But yeah, I would say this is something that is needed. I know schools are already doing critical thinking, but it goes beyond just asking the general questions. We were also taught critical thinking at school. We were all asked to interrogate, is that doctor a real doctor? Is that doctor a doctor of that topic? Who is the expert? But this goes further. Social media can have false images, false videos, and rely on false statements. So it does go a lot further than that. And I think it's really necessary. As for policy, this is not there yet. I mean, when we're looking at policy, we're looking at the online safety bill. We're looking at how we can regulate online. But I think that space being quite clear, there will not be an awful lot of regulation. The onus will be on us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I think what we're going to now do in terms of moving this debate forward is open up the floor to questions. We've got a number of questions that have come through now. So I'll be asking these questions and then inviting each one of our speakers who feel that it's their area of expertise to perhaps answer it, or if they feel they've got something important to add, then by all means, please do answer. So question number one is it social media becoming an addiction? And if it is becoming an addiction, do people sometimes lose perhaps their critical thinking skills in terms of some of the information that they're getting? And even again, from some verified media sources, perhaps at some of the more well-known media sources like the BBC or Sky News, and if they're making errors in their reporting and it's coming on social media, how do you then deal with that? And the element of addiction where it's coming and you just assume straight away that it's okay because it's coming from that trusted source. So that's open to any of our speakers. So just raise your hand. Yep, Charlotte.
I think this is maybe something that's somewhat outside of the scope of my research, whether or not it's becoming an addiction. But to answer generally, you know, I don't want to preach about well-being particularly, but I think it's common sense about how we filter we manage the time that we spend on these platforms, and we engage with multiple news sources, and we learn critical faculties about how to unpick news. I know actually during the Leicester experience, the BBC did something that I'm still following up with them on, where they had to hand reports, police reports, in which it was detailed that people were leaving their homes in Leicester. So they asked me to discuss that with them, and I shared the police reports. But they wanted to add balance to an article, so they called up the police and asked the police if there were reports specifically of people moving home. And the police said no, because the reports were actually about attacks on these individuals, and it was within the detail of the reports that they moved home. So the BBC were able to report that Charlotte reports the police has reported people moving home, but on contacting the police say that's not true. And the BBC had to hand all of the evidence from me on that. So I'm so disappointed to have to say that, and I hate to have to say that we even have to interrogate what's being said and read between the lines. If you read between the lines of that article, you could actually see the way they'd set up the paragraph. You could tell there was more information, where they said Charlotte reports, police have reported people moving home, the police say that's not true. So there wasn't a space that said we approached Charlotte for comment, and there wasn't a space that looked at what evidence I had. And normally you will have, and this organisation was approached for comment and here's their comment. So we really have to get very sharp, and that comes with a heavy heart, having to say that.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. Sarah?
When they're talking about social media addictions, I think there's a lot to do with the reward centers in the brain. So there are some studies that have already, come out, and there's been some debate around this about how hate speech and the reward centers from, the emojis and the likes and the way that integrates with your, I guess, emotional responses to produce patterns of emotional rewards and costs, emotional pressures, and some of it is highly stressful. We've had people committing suicide because of some of the content that's ended up online. Some very vulnerable people have been wrongly I guess mistreated, and it's ended up with tragedy. So I think it's really important. And when I did go to the eSafety Commissioner to discuss some of the complaints that I had, that, as Charlotte points out, some of them, they go into the defamation zone very quickly because we have limits to what they will act upon. And those acts, the things that they will act upon are things like if they target you, from a protected class, and then they make threats to hurt you, then that's something that they'll pick up on. And they did pick up on one death threat that was made against me very quickly, and I commend eSafety for doing that. But some of their advice was that, you're going to have to be careful because there's only so much that we can do for you. And some of the studies that have come out have shown that women academics are targeted, and they actually won't come out on social media and share their information or conduct social media discussions and debates about their research because they're afraid and they've been bullied. So there is a big problem when you talk about social media addictions. Be careful, because that that you put on someone's post that's actually harmful to someone else could cause them to have serious mental health issues, or, there are some, like I said, extreme cases. So, if it's getting to that point, I think it's important to give this message. It's just switch off. You can block, you can remove, you can switch off, you can close your account, you can lock your account. There's things that you can do, and it's not giving up. It's just, giving some space. Everybody needs space from time to time, but people need to be careful because this stuff builds and builds. And as we saw, it landed people into hate crime, and not just the victims. Obviously, they're the ones that require our sympathy. But the people who do these things, whether it's impulsive, whether they're led by someone else, it doesn't matter because it's no justification. When you stand up in court, you can say, and they did say, I was influenced by social media. It's not going to stop the judge from charging you and sentencing you. These things have very serious impacts on people's lives. So is it an addiction? It's a dangerous addiction if it is. And I think we need to be careful, just like we would with any other potentially addictive substance. And maybe there should be some type of addiction centers or, rehabilitation centers for people who just can't stop putting out or who are being emotionally affected by this.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Sarah. So the next question is looking specifically at the social media influencers. Now, we've seen perhaps the rise of individuals such as Andrew Tate, who perhaps have a disproportionate influence on young males who perhaps feel aggrieved. So how do we control these social media influencers, if at all we can control them? especially if we don't know enough about them or perhaps enough of a way of controlling them. So I guess the heart of the question is quality assurance. What kind of quality assurance can we have in terms of some of these social media influencers who perhaps have a nefarious agenda behind what they're doing and how they're doing it? So this question can go to anyone. I don't mind. Just unmute yourself and please feel free to answer. Dr. Visha Vora.
Thank you. I mean, the answer that I'll give, or the comment I'll give, is pretty short. In the nub of it is we can't control these people, because this would be verging on, the issue of free speech. But what we can do, and the other two speakers have already very eloquently highlighted this, is that we can empower our youth and empower citizens generally to fact check for themselves. And I think that is the only thing we can go on right now, have a variety of sources, read broadly, and I'd sort of say, without sounding nauseating about well-being, there is, this technology is very new. Social media is still very new, and we as a society are still coming to terms with what it has done to us. Speaking as a parent, I am constantly battling keeping screens away from my relatively young children. But the issue is they call out hypocrisy immediately, because they say, well, you're always on your phone or you're always on your computer, so why can't we? And this is the thing. I feel that as a society, things will settle down. But I think at the moment, we can't rely on governments. As I said in my short speech, it's incredibly difficult to draft legislation about this. And as the other two speakers have said, this immediately goes into issues of copyright, intellectual property, this kind of stuff. I think we need to empower our youth to call things out for themselves.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dr. Vora. So the next question, and this is just building up on something that you mentioned, Dr. Vora, in terms of free speech. And sometimes it's been posited that there's a thin line between free speech, hate speech, illegal speech, particularly whatever region we are in the world, we tend to know what is illegal speech. But what about hate speech, things that you can say that are not illegal? And how do we deal with things like that in terms of social media? Because social media essentially is an ecosystem. It's another community, a digital community. And we don't necessarily have those sorts of authorities that we have perhaps in the tangible real world. So how do we tackle the thorny issue of our right to free speech, and within that potentially being able to exercise our right to propagate hate, even though it's not illegal? So I think, Charlotte, that would be a good question for you, because you've looked at some of that in terms of your report.
Yeah, I think it's probably useful to start with the fact that that is the final decision on the online safety bill, is that it will end at illegal for adults. There will be a lot of control for those under the age of 18 and then under the age of 13. But yes, when we're looking at hate speech, harmful but not illegal, and when we're talking about illegal, we're talking about incitement to violence. But below that, we cannot restrict that. That is now the decision. That is how the bill is moving forward for the UK. And I think it's important that we do not restrict harmful but not illegal, because then who sets what is considered harmful? And we've seen with Elon Musk that we could have someone at the head of a social media platform that to an extent runs commentary and thought in the UK, making decisions according to his own value systems. And so we do have to have an open field there. And that then comes back to ourselves as responsible publishers and critical consumers. And the comments from Sarah as well about keeping ourselves safe mentally and emotionally. This is something that the onus is going to fall heavily on ourselves as individual actors on social media. And I think that's how we have to look at it. moving forward. So I think we have to build a strong shared value system, and we have to make sure that we're tackling issues of intolerance and promoting equality and cohesion. And we see online that there are certain groups that are very against that, and are pushing and lobbying ideas of intolerance, and those groups are extremist groups. We see it with the far right, we see it with Islamist extremism, we've seen it with Kanye West and anti-Semitism, and we saw it in Leicester. So we have to be aware, we have to be safe, we have to take care of ourselves, and that's all we can do, really.
Question here that's from a video question. So if I could just ask the technical team to play that question, and then I'll open that up to any one of our panelists who would like to answer that. So technical team, after you, please.
Countries might have borders, but social media does not. So shouldn't the countries be talking to each other to come up with a common regulation plan on macro issues such as fake news and the use of algorithms to maneuver opinion?
So thank you for that question. So that's open to any one of our panelists. Just raise your hand and you'll be unmuted, ready to answer that. Sarah.
Every country does have different regulations, and as we've seen, there's been some debate about India, blocking certain Twitter profiles in their country, but they're free to do so. And there is an Indian Twitter, and they are liable to follow the rules of the country. So each country may have its different rules, but like we saw after the Christchurch incident, which was actually played out on social media, we ended up with a whole range of different legislation that came into effect in New Zealand and Australia. And I think other countries can really look at that situation and learn from it, because this is a really worst case scenario. But we can't share now in these countries what's regarded as extremist content. And I think that's really important, that content is not shared. The government of India, the communications, I can't remember the name of the actual department, but the media authority put out a notice reminding the media that they can't share this type of extremist content. And this is being shared on their mainstream media from Twitter. They're taking videos from Twitter or other social media where, witnesses have uploaded these videos of brutal attacks, which could be, murder or other things. And other countries can force you to remove your content on Twitter. We know that. But I don't think there's enough monitoring of it. I think, there needs to be more monitoring, and as citizens that we have a role to play. And when we do see extremist content that is harmful to anyone who's viewing it, that needs to be, sent to the authorities. People need to be notified because it's not on. Nobody needs to see these type of brutal attacks going on because it can encourage copycat attacks, and that's why people were so hard on the legislation and social media as publishers, and all of this type of debates started happening. And now we do have laws and we do have responsibilities, and people do know where they stand. And you are responsible for putting that content out, even if you didn't create it. So, yeah, I think these laws are becoming more internationalized, and I think they should be. Like, we shouldn't be able to share terrorist content online, even if it's just for educational purposes. That's got to have its particular place in education institutions, but it shouldn't be there for people's emotional, benefit. If they are themselves extremists, they shouldn't be able to witness these type of things and be aroused or, inspired by them. So, yeah, I agree that there should be some international liaising and agreements, but they are there. It's not that they're not there.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Sarah. Okay, we've got another question here, which is perhaps going back to some of what we were looking at in terms of addiction to social media, and it now very much being part of many people's lives. I know when I was growing up, there was no social media. I didn't even have a mobile phone when I was at school. So it's very much changed now. Lots of children are going to school with mobile phones and smartphones, and they're able to access social media. And as a result of being able to access social media so easily, some of the content that you're also able to access is also very easy. And because of that, some people now rely on social media for their consumption of news and their trust in reputable organizations to provide that. But again, it's very easy now to be verified on Twitter, for example. And so some of our consumers are going to perhaps struggle to differentiate between verifiable news and news that is perhaps setting an agenda. So what do you think people can do other than going through perhaps that toolkit? Because people live a very busy lives, so it's going to be difficult. But so when they are accessing this news, how can they be sure that what they're accessing is proper in at the very least? So that's open to any of the panelists. Just raise your hand and you'll be unmuted. Charlotte?
I think it's important for me to just emphasize that although I've had a personal experience with the BBC, and although there are occasions in which the news can get things wrong and journalists can platform the wrong people, we saw the news platforming Majid Freeman, who I've already mentioned quite a few times, but ultimately it goes without saying that our mainstream media does legal checks, it has reviews done on its work, and it's very concerned about getting things wrong because it can face huge legal costs itself if it gets it wrong. So our mainstream media is still our most trusted source of information. And if you have the time, you can dig into things a bit more, but you might not have the time. So that would always be my go-to. When it comes to social media, it just does come to getting a sense of who are the speakers, who's contributing. If you're listening to Andrew Tate, you probably quite quickly will understand that he is not necessarily an actor to be trusted. You'll see how he's spoken about in other spaces. So you will get a sense for who can and cannot be trusted. And that's probably the only way in which that can be done in a brief response rather than using a toolkit. And I do think we've got to give credit to our younger generation. They've grown up with this. They have a greater skill for unpicking fake news from real news. They're almost like speak the language of social media in a way that for us is a little bit more clunky. I've heard from various friends of mine who are parents that actually they find that their children, I'm talking about older children here, so early teens, are actually quite good at discerning what is a fake post, a fake account, a fake video, and what is not. So we should also give credit to our young people for actually this is almost their language in a sense. Oh, we can't hear you there, Wasi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Charlotte. Dr. Vora, I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question on that, because there was a really important point that you made in your opening remarks in terms of there are two big companies that run social media essentially, and it got me thinking about Twitter and how to get verified, you just have to pay a subscription, and if you reply, your reply goes to the top. And so there's now almost a way to manipulate the kind of discourse. And is there any kind of insight that you could perhaps give or any downsides perhaps to that in terms of how the narrative is now changing depending on if you've got the financial means to perhaps do it? If you can just unmute Dr. Vora.
Yes. I think I appreciate that we're kind of running out of time, but let me just make one sort of statement. I echo the words of my fellow panelists. You know, mainstream media is still incredibly safe given where we are, but we as citizens need to be active. But let us not forget that the media back in the day was just controlled by rich people, rich men, you know, like 3 or 4 rich men, and nothing has really changed. So whilst we may be up in arms about what we can do now and the state of social media now, essentially it's just moved on from a print media to the online space. You know, that is just something, nothing has really degraded. It still remains up to the individual citizen. But in answer to your question about this, you know, there are just a few very, very powerful companies in charge of social media. I think that the only practical advice about social media is sort of just trying to do your due diligence. I appreciate that we live in busy times, but you know, if you're going to be retweeting something and they happen to have a blue tick, which is a sort of seal of approval that they are verified, just have a look at how many followers they have, for example, or just scroll back through their last 5 tweets or something like that to try and get a flavor. You know, quite often we forward news stories to friends, and certainly I receive them from friends saying, this news story totally encapsulates my view, but I know full well that that person hasn't read it to the end. This is just something that we need to sort of take advantage, take the opportunity. You know, this whole discussion was based on the, you know, the social media gaze, is it a threat or an opportunity? And so I'd like to end sort of on a vaguely positive note, that I think these are opportunities that we do need to take, and we need to be more active. As my colleagues have said, we need to report crimes when we see them. We need to report to moderators when we see hate or things that are bordering on hate. And we just need to take responsibility for ourselves in terms of, quite frankly, not being so lazy about forwarding things on Twitter or forwarding things on social media generally without doing that due diligence. So I hope that answers the question. But I in sort of closing, this blue verified tick that Elon Musk has seen to change is obviously ridiculous, and his success will no doubt change it back.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dr. Vora. So, right, what I'm going to do is just invite each of our panelists to give a 1-minute closing remarks on what they've discussed today and some of the feedback that they've got from each other. And then we will get ready to wrap up tonight's discussion. So I'm going to invite Sarah Gates to start. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wazik, and thank you, Vishal and Charlotte. It's been such a pleasure to listen to your views, and I'm sure we've got a lot more work to do together, and inviting other academics who are, you know, in different disciplinary areas to work together as a team, because we've all got our fortes, and it's, you know, we can complement one another with what we do. And hopefully people will stay in their lane a bit, which that'd be nice, because I do see people, you know, commenting as authorities on things that they're not authorities on. And one of those things is actually violence, which is what we've been talking about tonight. Violence, sexual violence, particularly, you know, the issues that have been going on within the different, you know, diaspora communities. I'm seeing a lot of stuff people talking about, you know, it's good to talk about violence and to call out hatred and violence, but it's also good not to give bad advice. It's also good not to give advice that puts people's lives at risk. As we saw with Leicester, with the case of a person who apparently was going to abduct a Muslim girl from a school, that led to the Birmingham, you know, massive being mobilised. That was fake news, but they did it in such a way to make it look like they were being protective of their daughters. So this type of stuff we really don't want to see. We want to see less of that. We want to see people who are authorities and experts stepping up in their particular field, and using their expertise and knowledge to give information, particularly to people, about how to act and respond to anything, whether it's hate speech or any type of violence that's happening in their community. In line with maybe Community Watch, we've got this type of thing that goes on here, Neighbourhood Watch, and bringing communities together with skills to actually keep their communities safe, whether it's online or in public. And just that needs to be, one of the, the community safety needs to be part of the judicial inquiry. This is why we want to have a judicial inquiry, because community safety is the priority. So community safety needs to become a priority for all organisations, all community organisations, and their role in actually promoting that community safety should be rewarded. So organisations that get taxpayer funds, if what they're doing is bringing disharmony to the community, why should any taxpayers be funding it? So, those people who are being funded, they have a responsibility and to the taxpayers and to the whole of society. So they should be rewarded for putting out information that builds social cohesion. That's my concluding remark. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you again for having us all on. That was a really interesting evening. And I think just to wrap up, I would just like to repeat that the onus is on us as critical receivers of information to make sure what we are taking from social media is positive for our mental health and emotional well-being, but that we are able to start to engage with whether or not this is truth, because as said by the police in Leicester, misinformation was key to the disorder there, and misinformation can be very damaging and will continue to be very damaging in all sorts of different areas. So it's down to us to be critical in how we receive that information, and it's for the UK government to step up and be bolder in tackling extremism. I sound like a broken record, but we still have hate preachers coming to the UK and giving talks and inciting hatred. We have organisations and charities that exist to sow division. And we have press outlets that solely exist to perpetrate this kind of divisive rhetoric. And that we do have ways in which to shut that down. We have a charity commission to disrupt charities. We have a Home Office to disrupt hate preachers, like having access to the country. And we have Ofcom to regulate press platforms. So we need to be bolder. We need to not shy away from this. 2023 needs to be a year of stepping up and tackling extremism, because social media is only a way in which that problem gets worse. So be a critical consumer, and come on, UK government, we need to step up.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. And then finally, Dr. Vora, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I echo the words of my fellow panelists. I feel like I'm having this second bite of the cherry, really, but I'll keep it very, very short. I think what happened in Leicester is a real wake-up call to the British Hindu community to get its house in order. I don't want to sound overly critical, but where were these British Hindu organisations when this was kicking off? They were nowhere to be seen. This is really, really an opportunity to consider your position, to find out what is happening within your communities and to report back. So to echo the words of Charlotte, make this year 2023 the year that you start doing this. And there are plenty of academics, myself included, who are more than happy to help. So reach out to us.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Dr. Vora. Some very encouraging words from all three of our panelists. I would just like to thank everyone for joining us. I think one of the things that I've taken away from this is that although there may be gaps in our knowledge, that's certainly an opportunity for us to fill. And we're only going to get better at this, and we're only learning. Social media is still in its infancy. It's only been around for around 2 decades. So we will get better at this. And I think we have to trust ourselves and the public. You know, we're not stupid people. We know what's bad and what's good, and we do tend to consume what is good. But there is the threat that some of us may turn towards what is bad, because there may be some sort of epistemic need that we need to obviously fill, and then that's where we need to think of perhaps a more multi-pronged approach to dealing with it. But thank you, everyone. That was great. Please continue the discussion. The hashtag is hashtag social media gaze. Please follow Open Forum on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. And I hope to see you all again at the next event. Thank you and good night.